And usually, and you guys know me, I'm a big fan of HGiG on the LG OLED TVs, but in this game I found HGiG just way too dark. My first recommendation is actually forget about HGiG in this game and give dynamic tone mapping on a try. And I found the same issue on my Samsung S95C. Without setting the contrast enhancer to low or high, I found the picture a little bit too dark. Even with the tone mapping option set to active, it was just not bright enough, because I'm expecting right now a very bright picture, but without contrast enhancer set to low or the dynamic tone mapping option on the LG OLED TV, the picture just doesn't look right. But using options like the dynamic tone mapping on the LG OLED TVs or contrast enhancer set to low or high on the Samsung QD OLEDs, this comes with a downside, because now you might end up with a very overbrightened picture during night missions in this game, or when you play a level which is darker than the normal day mission. So this is to consider, but regardless of that, I would still recommend give it a try. Try dynamic tone mapping option on the LG OLED TV and play around with the contrast enhancer on Samsung QD OLEDs. And now let's talk about the HDR system level calibration on the PlayStation 5, Xbox and PC. And yeah, not a big surprise, Assassin's Creed Mirage does not support the HDR system level calibration on the console or the PC. So let's take a closer look on the HDR in-game settings what we have in this game. And the first setting what we have is the HDR maximum peak brightness setting, which is responsible for the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. And then we have the exposure setting, which can give you a much darker picture or a much brighter picture. But as always, this setting comes with a big downside. So let's take a closer look on the maximum peak brightness setting in this game. And what I found is I would not go below 1000 nits maximum peak brightness, regardless of what TV you have. So even you have a LG CX, which is of course not capable of displaying maximum peak brightness or displaying specular highlights with a maximum peak brightness of around 1000 nits. But I found that when you decrease this setting from, let's say, 1000 to 800, you also change the average picture brightness slightly. So that's why my recommendation is the minimum setting for the maximum peak brightness in this game should be always 1000. And what I also found is that the maximum peak brightness setting in this game is not very accurate. So even I set this value right now to the maximum setting, which is 4000, the game doesn't output 4000 nits, at least not where I tested it so far. The maximum what I found was around 3500, 3600 nits, which of course is more than enough for most of the TVs, but the same counts actually when you set now the value to 1000. I found sometimes you have actually a higher value and sometimes a lower value. And that's why my second recommendation is actually always use the maximum peak brightness setting in this game a little bit higher than the maximum peak brightness capability of your TV to avoid under tracking the HDR maximum peak brightness. And now let's talk about the exposure setting, and my recommendation is do not increase it if you don't have to. And the reason is quite simple, because this game comes already with lifted blacks when you play the game in HDR. That means we have HDR black level rays, which results in a slightly washed out picture. So now when you increase the exposure setting, you will lift this HDR black level floor even further. The only thing what you can do if you find the picture a little bit too bright, after my recommendation to use dynamic tone mapping on the LG OLED TV or contrast enhancer set to low or high for the Samsung QD OLEDs, you can decrease this setting slightly to actually get you a picture what you like, because this will also bring down the HDR black level floor. For the issue what we have with the HDR black level rays in this game, we have actually a solution on the LG OLED TV called FTDA, fine-tuned dark area settings. And also we can use the shadow detail setting on the Samsung S95B or C. And now let's talk about colors, or let's talk about HDR colors. Is Assassin's Creed Mirage using the BT2020 color space? And the short answer is yes. Assassin's Creed Mirage is using the BT 2020 color space. So everything what you can see here right now in black and white is the HDR color range. Everything what you can see in yellow is the DCI P3 color range. And everything what you can see in blue is the BT 2020 color range. And because I know the question will come up, what about Dolby Vision? What is with Dolby Vision on the Xbox Series? And yeah, there is no native Dolby Vision support in this game, and my recommendation is still use dynamic tone mapping on, because Dolby Vision will be too dark as well. But if you use Dolby Vision gaming on an LG OLED TV, there would be most likely a slight difference compared to HDR10 HGiG, because Dolby Vision out of the box, Dolby Vision gaming out of the box on the LG OLED TVs, they are not very accurate calibrated compared to HDR10 HGiG. That means Dolby Vision gaming on the LG OLED TVs, they are slightly, or this picture mode is slightly brighter compared to HGiG. But still, my recommendation is use dynamic tone mapping on, because I found it just much better. Let's have a closer look on my recommended settings for Assassin's Creed Mirage on the PlayStation 5, Xbox and PC, and we're starting with the LG OLED TVs. So I told you already, the maximum brightness setting, in-game brightness setting should be 1000 nits. Even you use an LG CX with a maximum peak brightness of around 800 nits, I still recommend set the maximum peak brightness to 1000 nits. And for the LG G2 or similar TVs with a maximum peak brightness of around 1000 nits, set the maximum in-game slider to 1200. For the LG G3 or similar TVs with a maximum peak brightness of around 1400 nits, set the in-game slider to 1600. In regards to the exposure setting, I already told you that my strong recommendation is that you shouldn't touch it. But if you like to use it and if you like to increase it, then you also need to consider that you have to use different FTDA, different fine-tuned dark area setting. And that's not the only thing. We have also different FTDA setting between the console version and the PC version. And I'm very sure you're all capable of reading, so that's why I leave it to you to actually read this table and do the right setting. Again, my recommendation is for Assassin's Creed Mirage on the LG OLED TVs, use dynamic tone mapping on, do not change the exposure, set the maximum brightness accordingly, and yeah, change the fine-tuned dark area setting. Please keep in mind that as soon as you use the fine-tuned dark area setting on the LG OLED TVs, you must enable VRR. And now let's take a quick look on my recommended settings for Assassin's Creed Mirage on my Samsung S95C. So the maximum brightness setting, what I found fits the best, is 1800. Exposure, again, leave it as 0, because again, you would just lift the HDR black level floor. HDR tone mapping should be active, and then contrast enhancer, my recommendation is change it to low or high if you like it. ST2084, which is the EUTF curve, -1, and shadow detail, this is very important, set it to -5. So what is now my summary in regards of the HDR implementation in Assassin's Creed Mirage? And I like to be very honest with you, I think it's just average, and the reason is because with HGiG enabled it is just way too dark in my opinion. Maybe you have a different opinion, then put it in the comment section, but again, my recommendation is actually use dynamic tone mapping on, because you like to have a bright picture actually on a sunny day like this. You don't like to end up with a very dull picture when you use HGiG. And yes, we know about the downsides from dynamic tone mapping on versus HGiG. I know all about this, and usually I'm a huge fan of HGiG, but not in this game. Thank you very much for watching me, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.